The light above Marcus Webb's workstation had been flickering for 6 days. Chris had counted. Not because he was bored. He hadn't been bored once in the 2 weeks he'd been here. But because he noticed things like that now. Flickering lights, loose hinges, the particular way a compressor changes pitch when its bearings are starting to go. He'd learned to hear all of it by watching Marcus, and watching Marcus had become the most important thing he'd done in years. It was 12:31 a.m. The kitchen at Elara, Chicago's 5-star culinary destination on Michigan Avenue, awarded top honors by the country's most respected dining guides. $47 for a starter, 4-month waitlist for the chef's table. Was dark except for the emergency lighting and the fluorescent strip above the dish station. Everyone else had gone home. Naomi Briggs, the closing manager, had clocked out 40 minutes ago. Tyler Marsh, the line cook, had peeled off his apron and been gone by 11. The hostess, the servers, the sommelier who cleaned his own glasses and hummed jazz while he did it. Everyone except Marcus. He was kneeling behind the commercial range now, the 6-burner behemoth that anchored Elara's $250,000 kitchen, with a flashlight in one hand and a small toolkit laid open on the floor beside him. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, the particular focus of a person who knows what they're doing and is not showing off for anyone because there is no one to show off for. Chris stood very still in the maintenance corridor behind the kitchen, watching through the ventilation grate. His legs had been numb since midnight. He did not move. He'd been there every night for 2 weeks. And in 2 weeks, he had not once seen Marcus Webb do what everyone at Meridian Hospitality Partners had assumed he was doing. No theft, no sleeping on the job, no making personal calls or eating food that wasn't his. What Chris had seen instead, every single night, across 14 consecutive shifts, was a 44-year-old kitchen porter quietly, methodically, without a cent of additional pay, maintaining a 5-star restaurant as though it belonged to him. And tonight, something in the way Marcus was working had changed. He was faster, more focused. His jaw was tight in a way it usually wasn't. When the flashlight swept across the junction behind the range, Marcus held it there for a long moment and didn't move. Then he pulled out a small device from the canvas roll of tools, something Chris recognized after the 3rd night he'd seen it. A gas leak detector, professional grade, the kind they used on construction sites, not the kind you picked up at a hardware store. The device beeped. Marcus's whole body went still. He checked the reading twice. Then he opened his spiral notebook. Small, the spine wrapped in electrical tape, the pages soft and dark at the corners from weeks of being opened in the dark, and wrote something with the pen pressed hard, the way a person writes when what they're writing matters. Chris pressed his shoulder against the wall and thought about a meeting that had been scheduled for Thursday morning. And then he thought about the 9 months he'd been watching Elara's numbers improve, without understanding why. And then he stopped thinking about spreadsheets entirely, because Marcus was already working on the junction, and Chris could not look away. This is how a disaster gets prevented, not with contractors and quarterly inspections, with one man and a canvas roll of tools at 12:41 a.m. after everyone else has gone home. But Chris hadn't known that 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, he'd been on a flight from Sydney, first-class cabin, 14 hours, somewhere over the Pacific, staring at a spreadsheet that didn't add up in any of the ways spreadsheets usually don't add up. Chris Hemsworth had been a silent majority investor in Meridian Hospitality Partners for 4 years. Not a name on the door, not a face at the ribbon-cutting ceremonies, the kind of investor who shows up in a legal document and then stays out of the way, because that's the deal when you trust the operators you've chosen. You let them operate. For 3 of those 4 years, Elara had been the group's flagship, a 5-star destination that held its reputation the way good restaurants hold their silence, earned carefully over a long time. But in the last quarter, something had shifted in the maintenance numbers. Emergency repair calls had dropped by 43%. The monthly inspection reports were coming back cleaner than they'd ever been. The equipment, which should have been aging predictably, linearly, seemed to be holding. Better than holding. His CFO had flagged it as anomalous. Good anomalous, but anomalous. You don't get better maintenance outcomes by spending less on maintenance contracts unless someone's doing work the contracts aren't capturing. Chris had read that note and put it down and then picked it up again an hour later. He knew what it sounded like when something in a building was being taken care of by someone who cared about it. He'd grown up around it. He'd done it himself in a different life. So he'd called a staffing agency on the west side of Chicago, given them a name, and shown up for a kitchen porter shift at Elara at 6 on a Monday morning. The beard was 3 weeks old. The jacket was his, worn gray canvas, scuffed at the elbows, the kind of thing he wore when he was working in Byron Bay. Nobody looked twice. His name tag said Ray. Nobody recognizes a 6'4" Australian in a kitchen because nobody expects to find one there. That was the first thing he learned. The second thing he learned was Naomi Briggs. She was 32, the closing manager, and she'd been with Elara for 4 years. She ran the back of the house with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd made peace with the gap between what the restaurant could be and what it usually managed. She was the first person to hand Chris a mop and show him where the supply room was. She was the first person to call him by his cover name naturally, without thinking about it. And she was the first person to look at him a beat too long. On the third day, when he was restacking a delivery of dry goods near the pantry, the delivery crew had stacked the cases wrong. Weight in the wrong order, no clearance on the bottom tier, the kind of stacking that leads to cascade failures in tight spaces. Chris had quietly rearranged everything in about 45 seconds. He'd done it the way you do it when muscle memory takes over, when you've spent enough time on loading docks and building sites that your hands just know. He hadn't thought about it. Naomi had been standing in the doorway when he finished. She didn't say anything, but she was looking at him the way you look at something that doesn't quite fit the category you've placed it in. "Sorry," Chris said. "Old habit." "No," she said. "It's better this way." She held his gaze one more second, then moved on. That was how it started with Naomi. She never said anything to the others, but from that day forward, she'd made small adjustments, putting Chris on shifts where he'd be near the kitchen rather than the dining room, finding reasons to have him close when things needed doing. She didn't know what she knew, she just knew something. The first witness ally always works that way. They feel it before they can name it. The pattern with Marcus had started on day 2. Chris had been finishing his shift when he noticed that Marcus hadn't left. The other staff were gathering their things, pulling on jackets, saying the particular compressed goodbyes of people who need to get home. Marcus was still at his station, still working, not faster, not slower, the same methodical rhythm he'd maintained for 12 hours. "Marcus, you good to lock up?" Naomi called from the office. "Yes, Miss Naomi, you go ahead." She'd left. Chris had waited in the supply corridor. At 11:52 p.m., Marcus finished the last dish. He dried his hands. He folded the towel and hung it on the designated hook, third from the left, always. Then, instead of getting his jacket, he went to the equipment wall and pulled out a small canvas roll from behind the industrial mixer, a toolkit, his own. He worked for 2 hours. He tightened the loose bracket on the shelf near the walk-in cooler, the one that had been listed in the maintenance log as pending for 3 weeks. He replaced a frayed electrical cord on the backup heating lamp. With commercial-grade wiring, he'd brought in a Ziploc bag in his locker. He tightened the oven door handle that every cook had learned to pull with 2 hands instead of 1. Small things, invisible things, the kind of things that don't show up in reports because they're fixed before they become problems. On the 4th night, Chris watched Marcus service the industrial dishwasher, removing the front panel with practiced ease, cleaning components that hadn't been touched since installation. On the 5th night, the walk-in cooler's seal and condenser coils cleaned with a brush Marcus had brought from home. By the 6th night, Chris had stopped being surprised. He'd started being troubled, not by what Marcus was doing, by why. Why would a kitchen porter earning $21 an hour invest 3 hours of his own sleep, his own tools, his own parts, every single night, to maintain a restaurant that would replace him tomorrow if he called in sick? What kind of person does that? And what does it say about the people who've never bothered to notice? He wrote in his phone, "Marcus Webb, staying 2 to 3 us after close. Not stealing, not sleeping, fixing equipment, his own tools, his own parts." Why? How does he know how? Why no overtime? Why no recognition? He looked at that list for a long time in the parking lot afterward, sitting in the car he'd rented, a plain mid-sized sedan, nothing that would draw attention, while the street lights made long orange shapes on the windshield. He didn't have answers yet. But he was starting to understand that the question was more important than the spreadsheet had been. The conversation happened on a Wednesday afternoon, back steps, 2:47 p.m. Marcus took his break there every day. Not with the smokers. He didn't smoke, just for the air. He sat on the second step with his hands wrapped around whatever he was drinking, and he watched the delivery alley the way someone watches the ocean, like it was telling him something. Chris brought 2 bottles of water out and sat down beside him. Marcus looked surprised. People didn't usually sit with him. "You ever get tired?" Chris asked, handing one over. Marcus accepted it without much ceremony.
Of what?
"Being here this long."
The hours.
"The hours are fine." He looked at the alley. A truck was backing in with the high-pitched beeping of something too large for the space. "I've worked longer." "Construction?" A small nod. "Maintenance mostly. My father's trade. He had me on job sites when I was 9 years old." Chris kept his voice even. "What kind of sites?" "All kinds." Marcus turned the water bottle in his hands. "Commercial buildings. Industrial." He could lay his hand on a piece of machinery and tell you what was wrong with it by the vibration. Used to say everything talks, most people just don't know how to listen. "He's still around?" The truck found its angle and the beeping stopped, a long beat of quiet. "He passed 6 years ago. Flat, the way people say things they've made peace with because they've had no choice." Gas explosion. Job site in Columbus. The inspection crew had cleared a subfloor junction. Paperwork all signed, everything on record. But nobody had actually gone in to check it. They just signed it and moved on. He held the water bottle with both hands and looked at it. "My father went in for his regular walkthrough. The line let go." Chris did not say anything. "He was 57, Marcus said. He had another 8 years of work in him. Easy. He always said he'd retire when his hand stopped working, and they never did." He paused. He would have been 63 in April. The alley was very quiet. Somewhere on Michigan Avenue, a cab horn. The distant sound of a city that didn't know this conversation was happening. "After that, I couldn't work around other crews," Marcus said. "Every job site, every piece of heavy equipment, I kept seeing it. I'd freeze up. Dishwashing was the only job where I could work alone, quiet, contained." He looked at his hands. "You can't unlearn what someone teaches you when you're 9. So I still hear the machines talking. I still fix what needs fixing." He used to say, "If you see it and you know how, you have a responsibility. It's not about the job description." He almost smiled, the kind of almost smile that costs something. "He'd probably be disappointed in me, washing dishes at 44. "I don't think so," Chris said. Marcus looked over at him, just briefly, the particular look of someone who's heard enough hollow comfort to recognize it and not quite trust what he's hearing isn't more of the same. "The notebook," Chris said before he could think better of it. "You keep one." Marcus's expression shifted. "Careful now. You've seen it?" "Just the cover. I was curious." "That was almost true. What's in it?" A long pause. "Records." He stood up, brushing off his work pants. The break was ending. "My father kept records. He said if you didn't write it down, you didn't do it." He tucked the water bottle under his arm. "Thanks for sitting." He went back inside. Naomi was already calling from the doorway. Chris sat on the step for a while longer. He thought about a man who had died in a subfloor because someone had signed a form they hadn't earned. He thought about a 9-year-old learning to listen to machines. He thought about a notebook with electrical tape on the spine, full of dates and junction numbers, and the particular handwriting of someone who believed in keeping records, because his father had taught him that records were a form of respect. And then he thought about something he hadn't let himself think about in a long time. In the summer of 2003, when he was 19 years old, and in working a loading dock in Darwin, before any of the other life, before the cameras and the contracts and the $130 million decisions, he had watched a foreman falsify a structural inspection on a warehouse extension. The man had signed the form in the cab of his truck without getting out. 3 weeks later, a section of the secondary frame gave way during a delivery shift. Nobody died. One man broke his wrist, and 2 others were close enough to feel the air move when the beam came down. It could have been much worse. Chris had been 20 feet away. He had never forgotten the sound. Not the impact, but the dry creak that came before it, in the moment when the structure was deciding. And he had never forgotten the particular way the foreman looked when he heard it. Not surprised, just calculating. He still carried that. He had carried it across 2 decades and across every investment he'd ever made, and it was still there, like a habit that had never fully loosened. It was why he paid attention to places where someone was supposed to be watching and wasn't. It was why he'd stepped off a first-class cabin in Sydney and gotten on the next flight to Chicago when the numbers stopped making sense. It was why he'd walked into a staffing agency on the West Side 3 weeks ago and asked for a porter shift. It was, he realized, why Marcus Webb made complete sense to him in a way that almost nothing else did. He thought about Elara's maintenance contractors, who were paid $8,400 a month to do a fraction of what Marcus Webb did for free every night, and he thought, something has to change. Corporate moved on Friday morning. Derek Sloan arrived in a black German sedan at 9:15 a.m. with a Meridian Hospitality Partners badge and a security report. He was 38, regional compliance manager, the kind of man who wore authority as a performance and whose suits were always slightly too sharp for the room. He reported to Brad Holloway, the group's senior VP of operations, a name that appeared on documents Chris had signed 4 years ago, and that he associated with good quarterly presentations and very little apparent curiosity about what happened below the executive level. Derek spread the security report on Naomi's desk, printed stills from the kitchen cameras, timestamped, Marcus entering at 11:47 p.m., Marcus with his toolkit, Marcus with a key at the electrical panel, Marcus at the gas line junction behind the range. 9 unauthorized after-hours entries, Derek said. On each occasion, the employee in question accessed restricted infrastructure without certification, without supervisor knowledge, using personal tools and, on at least one occasion, a key he was not authorized to possess. He tapped the photos. The liability exposure is significant. We're recommending immediate termination. Naomi looked at the photos for a long moment. He fixes things, she said. We don't know that. The oven, 3 Thursdays ago. Emergency call canceled because he had it running in 20 minutes. $430 we didn't spend. She looked up. I've seen him work. He knows what he's doing. That's not the relevant question. Derek's voice was patient in the particular way of someone who has already decided. An uncertified individual accessing gas infrastructure creates liability regardless of outcome. One incident, and we're looking at OSHA violations, workers' comp claims, potential negligence suits. The fact that nothing has gone wrong yet is luck. It is not policy. He gathered the photos into a neat stack. I need the termination completed before Thursday. Naomi's expression did not change. He mentioned the gas line this week. Junction B, behind the range. He said it needs full replacement, not just the gasket, that he'd ordered parts with his own money. Derek looked at her, all the more reason to act now rather than wait for an incident that we facilitated by ignoring known unauthorized activity. He tucked the folder under his arm. Thursday, Naomi. Brad wants the location clean before the inspection. He left. Naomi stood at her desk for a moment, her hand resting on the edge of it, looking at nothing in particular. Chris had been nearby, wiping down a prep counter, invisible the way kitchen porters are supposed to be invisible, and he watched her face do something careful, something that was not agreement. That evening, she stopped Marcus on his way to the break room. Marcus. She kept her voice low. Corporate's been watching the building monitors. They're tracking after-hours access very closely right now. She paused. I wanted you to know. Marcus looked at her steadily. Okay, Miss Naomi. I know you like to make sure things are right. I know that. But they're calling it unauthorized access. They're using words like liability. She held his gaze. Be careful. I understand. That night, Marcus clocked out at exactly 11:04 p.m. He said goodnight to Naomi. He picked up his jacket from the hook by the back door. He walked out. Chris was already in the maintenance corridor. He waited 47 minutes. At 11:51 p.m., the back door clicked open. Marcus had come back. He had clocked out, left the building, returned on his own time with his own tools, and gone straight to the gas line behind the range. Tonight, his movements were different, quicker, more urgent. When the leak detector beeped at Junction B, his jaw went tight. He wrote in the notebook with sharp, pressing strokes. Then he isolated the valve, released the pressure safely, replaced the deteriorating gasket, and tested the seal 3 times before reassembling everything. 53 minutes of work that Chris could only have estimated the value of at somewhere around $400 an hour in contractor rates. When Marcus finished, He stood in the center of the dark kitchen and turned slowly, checking everything with the expression of someone making sure a door is locked before leaving for a long time. He pulled out his phone, old cracked at one corner, and took a photograph of the kitchen. He stood looking at it for a long moment. "Sleep well," he said quietly to the empty room. Then he locked up and left. Chris emerged from the corridor. He walked to Junction B and crouched down and pressed his palm flat against the pipe, eyes closed the way Marcus had shown him without knowing he was showing him anything. He held very still. He thought about a man who had died in Columbus because a form got signed that shouldn't have been. He thought about a 9-year-old learning to listen to machines. He thought about the inspection scheduled for Thursday morning and what would happen to that junction if the only person watching it was gone. He got in his rental car and sat in the parking lot until 2 a.m. The sky above Michigan Avenue was the particular orange of a city that never gets fully dark. He had 14 windows open on his laptop. Maintenance records, employee files, contractor invoices, inspection reports going back 3 years. The numbers told a story he should have found months ago. Over the 8 months Marcus had been at Elara, emergency repair calls had dropped 43%. The monthly inspection reports had grown progressively cleaner. The restaurant had sailed through 2 safety reviews with minor notes. None of that was in the contractor reports. All of it was in Marcus's notebook. He called his attorney at 2:17 a.m. Chicago time. "I need you on a plane to Chicago in the morning," he said, "and I need everything we have on the Meridian Partnership Agreement." The termination meeting was at 7:15 a.m. on Wednesday. Brad Holloway had flown in from the regional office in Indianapolis on a private charter the evening before and was at Elara at 7, in a suit that announced how seriously he took himself. He was 52 and had the particular confidence of a man who had built a career on making decisions look inevitable. Derek Sloan was already there. They were using Naomi's office. Chris was in the maintenance corridor before anyone arrived. He'd come in at 5:30 a.m. He heard Marcus arrive at 6:58 a.m., humming something under his breath, the low, tuneless hum of a man starting a shift he was content to be at, with no idea what was coming. Locker opening, lunch bag going in, the sound of work clothes being settled, the small domestic sounds of a person getting ready to spend the day at something they know how to do. Then Naomi's voice, careful. "Marcus, could you come to the office for a moment?" The humming stopped. The next 17 minutes, Chris heard everything through the wall. Brad Holloway's voice, polished, firm, the voice of a man accustomed to reading corporate language as though it were a kindness. Security footage. Unauthorized access, restricted infrastructure, liability, termination, effective immediately. A silence that went on long enough to have weight. Then Marcus, Junction B, the gas line Junction B behind the main range. "It needs full section replacement. Not just the gasket I put in Monday night, the whole section. The pipe is corroded. I have documentation. I have parts at my apartment that arrived Tuesday. I ordered them with my own money. They're ready to install. Mr. Webb, the walk-in cooler compressor has a failing bearing. You'll hear it if you put your ear to the housing. It's going to seize within 10 days, probably less." His voice was very steady, which told Chris everything about what it was costing him to keep it that way. The fire suppression gauge on the east panel reads false high. Actual pressure is 15% below safety standard. I've been documenting every one of these in the notebook. If you'll look at the notebook, Mr. Webb, please. Derek's voice, smooth, final. "Collect your things." Another silence, different from the first. Then, very quietly, Marcus said, "My father died because someone signed off on a gas inspection they never actually performed. They went through the paperwork and skipped the subfloor and signed it clean. He walked into a junction that hadn't been checked in 3 months, and it let go. A pause the length of a held breath. I'm not asking for anything. I know that doesn't change your decision. I needed someone to know why I was here." The silence after that was the kind that arrives in rooms after something true has been said. Even Brad Holloway seemed to feel it. His chair did not scrape back immediately. Then it did. 2 weeks severance. HR will be in contact. Security will accompany you to collect your belongings. Chris's hand was on the corridor door, his palm flat against it. He stood there, 6'4", motionless, and listened to Marcus stand up and walk out. He heard the footsteps come down the hallway. 5 feet from where he stood, he pressed back against the wall. Through the ventilation grate, he watched Marcus cross the kitchen, pick up his canvas tool roll from behind the mixer. The one Marcus had paid for himself. The one that had lived in that kitchen for 8 months, doing work the contractors billed thousands to leave undone. And walked to the back door. He stopped there. 1 second. He looked back at the kitchen, the stainless steel, the commercial fixtures, the emergency lights casting red-orange across the floor. Then he walked out. The door shut, the lock engaged. Chris stood in the corridor with both hands flat against the wall and did not move. He had made a calculation, the rational, executive calculation, that breaking cover too early would compromise everything, that he needed more time, that the investigation was broader than one person. He had told himself that was strategy. Standing in the corridor at 7:32 a.m., with the sound of Marcus's footsteps still in his ears, he was beginning to understand what it actually was. That afternoon, Brad Holloway held a brief status meeting in Naomi's office. Chris was mopping the hallway outside, close enough to hear. "The contracted maintenance team is coming in Friday morning," Brad said. "Full assessment before the inspector arrives Thursday. We'll have a clean bill going into the review." A pause. "This is the right call. We can't have uncertified individuals operating on critical infrastructure. One incident and we lose the entire portfolio." Chris mopped the same section of floor twice. The contracted team arrived Friday morning. 4 technicians, clean uniforms, a van with the company logo. They spent 3 hours in the kitchen. They checked what they could see. They wrote their report from the walkway, their assessment. All systems within normal operating parameters. Minor notes on the ventilation hood filters, nothing critical. Brad forwarded the report to the board with a note. "Chicago location clear for Thursday inspection." Chris read it on his phone in the hotel suite on the 31st floor, the room with the view of Lake Michigan, where the city laid itself out at your feet and made you feel like anything was still possible. He read it twice. Then he put on his coat and went back to the kitchen. It was 10:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. The staff had gone home. He let himself in through the rear entrance, the small wedge he'd been using for 2 weeks, and walked to the commercial range. He knelt behind it. He pressed his palm against the pipe at Junction B. He held very still, and even without the professional instrument, even without the years of training, he could feel what Marcus had been documenting for weeks. Not the sound of a line that was fine, the sound of something that was holding on. He called the emergency maintenance line at 11:12 p.m. "This is Chris Hemsworth. I'm the majority investor in Meridian Hospitality Partners. I need a licensed technician at the Elara Chicago location right now. Potential gas line issue, Junction B, behind the main range." The technician arrived at 12:48 a.m. He spent 20 minutes at the junction and then turned to look at Chris with the expression of someone choosing their words carefully. "This section's been patched recently. Good work." Whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing. But the underlying pipe is corroded. It's been leaking slowly for weeks, maybe months. The patch slowed it down but couldn't stop it. He pointed to the joint. "At full service load, all 6 burners, high-volume dinner shift, this fails. Could be Monday, could be 6 months. But it fails." He paused. "You said there's an inspection Thursday morning? 9 a.m. The inspector will find this immediately." Chris looked at the pipe for a long moment. He thought about Marcus's notebook. He thought about October entries and November entries, and the word Junction B appearing in the same careful handwriting, week after week. "Make it safe for tonight," he said. "Full replacement starts first thing tomorrow." The technician worked until 3:00 a.m. Chris sat on an overturned milk crate in the corner of the kitchen and watched him work, and he did not look away, and he thought about what it costs when the wrong people get fired. The inspection team arrived at 9:04 a.m. Thursday. 3 officials, clipboards. The brisk efficiency of people who are not interested in being charmed. Patricia Whitfield led the team. She had 22 years in commercial kitchen safety. She moved through the space the way people move through spaces they know better than the owners do. The walk-in cooler first. She listened to the compressor, 30 seconds. Her pen moved. The fire suppression panel. She checked the gauge, opened the access panel, checked the actual pressure. Her expression did not change. Her pen moved again. Junction B. She knelt behind the commercial range with a gas detector identical to the one Marcus carried in his canvas roll. The device beeped within 45 seconds. She stood up. She looked at Naomi, who had been following the team with the careful expression of someone who already knows what's coming. Your gas system at Junction B shows evidence of a recent emergency repair, Patricia said. The repair is adequate as a temporary measure but does not meet code as a permanent solution. The underlying pipe section requires full replacement. She made a note. The walk-in compressor bearing is failing. You have days, not weeks. The fire suppression system is running at 61% of required pressure. The gauge is reading false high. She turned the page. 3 critical violations. I'm issuing a partial closure order. Cold service only until each violation is corrected and a re-inspection is passed. You have 72 hours. Naomi sat down. She sat down the way someone sits when the weight of something becomes too much for legs. Brad Holloway came through the kitchen door at that moment with the expression of a man who had been told Thursday morning would be a formality. He looked at Patricia Whitfield. He looked at the partial closure order in her hand. He looked at Naomi. The color left his face in a way that was almost architectural. Chris set down the mop he'd been holding. He crossed the kitchen floor in 12 measured steps. In the way he was walking, something had changed, not faster, not slower, but with the particular steadiness of a person who has stopped performing a version of themselves. Brad Holloway turned to look at him. Derek Sloan looked at him. Naomi looked at him. Nobody said anything. Not yet. You failed, Chris said. He was addressing Brad. Every item on that closure notice. Marcus Webb told you about every one of them by name 3 days ago. He had the documentation. He had parts ready to install. He reached into his coat and laid Marcus's notebook on the prep counter between them, the one Naomi had kept from his locker because she hadn't been able to bring herself to throw it out. Every entry dated, every junction number documented, 8 months of records kept by a man who was paying for his own parts, working 3 hours past his shift without a cent of extra pay, because he understood what this building needed and nobody else bothered to look. Brad's voice, very careful. Who are you? My name is Chris Hemsworth. I'm the majority investor in Meridian Hospitality Partners, and I've been working in this kitchen for 2 weeks as a porter because the numbers stopped making sense and I needed to understand why. He held Brad's gaze. I understand now. The kitchen was very quiet. Even the compressor, the failing compressor that Marcus had flagged 10 days ago, seemed to hold its breath. Brad straightened his jacket, the reflex of a man who needs time to think. The termination of Mr. Webb was a compliance decision based on documented unauthorized access to restricted. He was protecting people. Chris's voice did not rise. He was protecting the staff who work in this kitchen, and the customers who eat in the dining room, and the company that employs all of them, with his own tools, and his own money, and his own time, because his father taught him that if you see it, and you know how, you have a responsibility. And you fired him for it. He had let that sit for one breath. You're going to hear from my attorneys this afternoon regarding the partnership agreement. Derek, your employment with Meridian is terminated effective today. HR will contact you regarding the details of your separation. Brad, the board convenes Friday. Be available. Brad did not respond immediately. He stood looking at the notebook on the prep counter, the small spiral notebook with electrical tape on the spine, the pages thick and worn at the corners. After a moment, as though he hadn't meant to, he reached over and picked it up. He opened it to a page near the middle. The entries were dated. The handwriting was small and even, the handwriting of someone who had been taught that the record was the work. He read one entry all the way through, then the entry below it. He stopped on the line dated 4 days before the termination. Junction B slows confirmed, recommend full section replacement, parts ordered, personal expense will monitor daily. He read that line twice. Then he closed the notebook. He set it down on the counter very carefully, the way you set something down when you've understood something that cannot be undone. His hand stayed on the cover a moment longer than it needed to. He did not look at anyone in the room. He picked up his phone. He dialed Marcus Webb. It rang 4 times. Then a voice, cautious, recognizing an unknown number. Marcus, this is Chris Hemsworth. I'm the investor who owns the majority stake in Meridian Hospitality Partners. A pause for that to land. I'm also the guy who's been mopping your floors for the past 2 weeks. A very long silence. I watched you every night, Chris said. The notebook, the gas detector, every junction you checked. I saw you come back after clocking out and work on that line at midnight because you were worried about it. He looked around the kitchen, the five-star culinary destination, the internationally starred room that had been running safely for 8 months because one man had decided his father's standard was more important than his job title. "We failed the inspection this morning. Exactly where you said we would. You were right about all of it." Silence. "I'm calling to offer you a position. Director of Kitchen Safety and Facilities for the Elara Group. Full-time. $64,000 a year. Full benefits. Your own team. A proper maintenance budget. And the certification support to get your credentials formalized. Your job will be exactly what you've already been doing, but recognized, compensated, and with the authority to fix problems before they have the chance to hurt anyone." Very quietly, after a long moment, "You were there. Every night, every night. Why didn't you stop them from?" "I should have." Chris said it without qualification. "I made a calculation that was wrong. I have no good explanation for it, and I'm not going to offer one." He paused. "The only thing I can offer is this conversation, and the job, and the request that you give us the chance to do right by you, even though we should have done it months ago." Another silence. The particular silence of someone weighing something that costs something. "The parts for Junction B," Marcus said finally. "They're at my apartment. I'll send a car." Marcus arrived at noon. He walked through Elara's kitchen door in the same jacket he'd been fired in 3 days before, the canvas tool roll under his arm, moving the way he always moved. Unhurried, knowing the room, belonging to it in a way that had nothing to do with the name on his employment contract. He looked at Chris for a long moment. Really looked. "You missed the grease spot by the dishwasher," he said. "Every day." Something pulled at the corner of Chris's mouth. "I did. Seconds from left on the anti-fatigue mat. It builds up where the drainage is slow. Show me sometime." Marcus set down his tool roll. He got to work. By 3 that afternoon, Junction B was properly repaired. Full section replacement, code compliant, tested 3 times. By 5, the compressor bearing had been replaced, the fire suppression pressure was corrected, and Marcus had produced a written list of 15 secondary issues across the building that needed attention over the next 30 days. Things that wouldn't have surfaced for months. Things the contractors had walked past for years. Tyler Marsh, the line cook who had known for weeks that Marcus was fixing equipment and had said nothing during the termination meeting, who had watched from the kitchen doorway as Marcus was walked out and had gone home and slept badly, came to find Chris at 6:15 p.m. that evening. He stood in the hallway for a moment before speaking, the way people stand when they know the conversation they're about to have is going to cost them something. "I knew," he said, "about the oven, about the gas leak detector. He showed me the reading last month, told me he was monitoring it. I should have said something when they were questioning him. I had a reason not to. I've got a daughter, shared custody, I need steady income, He stopped. "There's no version of that where I come out looking okay." Chris looked at him for a moment. "You're telling me now, for what it's worth." "It's worth something," Chris said. "Make sure Marcus knows you came. That's the conversation that matters." Tyler found Marcus at 6:45 p.m., working on the ventilation filters. He stood nearby for a moment. Marcus kept working without looking up. Then Tyler said something quiet, and Marcus set down the brush, and they stood there for a while in the particular way of 2 people working something out that doesn't need an audience. Chris watched from across the kitchen and did not move closer. Patricia Whitfield returned Thursday morning, 8 days after the original inspection. She spent 90 minutes. She checked everything twice. When she emerged from the kitchen, she stopped beside Chris in the dining room and looked down at her clipboard with the expression of someone who has been doing this job long enough to recognize the difference between a kitchen that passes and a kitchen that is genuinely cared for. "Passed with distinction," she said. "The gas system is excellent. The suppression system is at 107% of required pressure. The compressor is new." She paused. "I've been in this building 4 times over 3 years. This is the best I've seen it." She looked at him. "Whatever changed, keep doing it." 3 months later, the notebook was framed. It hung on the wall just inside the kitchen entrance, the original electrical tape on the spine, pages still faintly stained from the nights they'd been opened in the dark with a flashlight. Next to it, a photograph. Marcus and his father, standing in front of a job site in Columbus on a summer afternoon in the early 2000s, both of them in work belts, both of them squinting into the same light. Marcus had put the photo up himself on his third morning as director of kitchen safety and facilities. He hadn't said anything about it. He'd just hung it level, stepped back, checked that it was right, and gone to start his rounds. Below the frame, a small plaque. Naomi had ordered it quietly, without asking anyone's permission. If you see it and you know how, you have a responsibility. Donna Reese, a server who had been let go from Elara 4 months before Marcus arrived, after she'd reported to corporate that a contracted inspector had signed off on a kitchen safety review without entering the sub-floor, came back to the restaurant on a consulting contract to train the new floor staff. She had never met Marcus. When she heard his story, she stood in the kitchen for a full minute looking at the photograph. His father would have been proud, she said. Among the 4 employees who came forward to the Department of Labor was James Kowalski, a former prep cook who described, in writing and then in person, the afternoon of April 9th, a full Tuesday lunch service, 13 kitchen staff at their stations. When Derek Sloan had stopped the line entirely to announce, in a voice that carried to the service window and into the dining room beyond it, that James had created a serious liability event by mentioning to a visiting district manager that the exhaust ventilation hood hadn't been serviced in 15 months. Derek had used the word unprofessional 6 times. He had said James's name loud enough that the front-of-house staff heard it. James had clocked out that evening, collected his knives, and not returned. He had told no one what happened. He told the Department of Labor investigator that he came forward because for the first time, someone had gone first. Brad Holloway submitted his resignation from Meridian Hospitality Partners 18 days after the Thursday inspection. The statement cited personal reasons, which his PR firm had written and which nobody believed. The Illinois Department of Labor opened a formal inquiry into wrongful termination practices at 3 of the group's locations, following accounts from 4 former employees who had been dismissed for raising safety concerns. The inquiry was ongoing as of the following quarter. Ardent Capital Holdings, the parent fund through which Meridian's portfolio was held, recorded a $2 million reduction in asset valuation in their fourth quarter review, the first negative adjustment in 9 consecutive quarters, attributing the figure directly to the Chicago location's insurance surcharge, reinspection costs, and projected legal exposure from the labor inquiry. A trade publication ran a story with the headline, "The Hidden Cost of Corporate Compliance Culture." The headline trended across the hospitality industry for 11 days. Derek Sloan found employment 6 weeks later at a regional restaurant group in St. Louis. He listed his departure from Meridian as voluntary. He did not mention the inspector's closure notice in the interview. Marcus Webb's facilities team identified and addressed safety concerns at all 4 Meridian locations within the first quarter. Emergency maintenance costs across the group dropped 66%. Staff satisfaction scores at Elara rose for the first time in 3 years. Chris visited Elara once a month. Every time he walked through the kitchen door, he did one thing first. He looked at the notebook on the wall. Not the plaque, not the photograph. Just the notebook. The electrical tape on the spine, the pages worn soft from being opened in the dark in rooms no one else was watching for 8 months, by a man who had never asked for a single thing in return. And every time he looked at it, he thought about what happens in organizations when the people who care the most are invisible to the people with the most power. He thought about all the other Marcus Webbs, in every kitchen, every building, every institution, quietly doing the work that holds everything together, unseen until the moment they stop. The most important person in any room is often the one you never think to look at. And the greatest failure of leadership is not cruelty, it is inattention. On Marcus's first morning as director, Chris arrived at 6 a.m. and found him already in the kitchen, walking the floor with his clipboard, checking everything in the particular order he'd always used: gas lines, refrigeration, electrical, ventilation. The particular methodical calm of someone who has made peace with the size of that job and is not rushing. Marcus paused at his old station, looked at it for a moment. Then he turned on the light above the sink, the one that had been flickering for 6 days when Chris first arrived. Someone had replaced the bulb. It came on clean and steady, without hesitation. "Good morning," Marcus said to the empty kitchen. Chris stood in the doorway and did not say anything. because some moments are not improved by words. What stayed with me most about Marcus Webb's story wasn't the inspection report. It wasn't even the moment he walked back through that kitchen door. It was the notebook, the electrical tape on the spine, the pages worn soft at the corners from being opened night after night in rooms no one else was watching. That kind of care doesn't come from policy or performance reviews or the promise of a promotion. It comes from somewhere older than any of that, from a father who taught his son that the work itself is what matters, and that you don't get to stop caring just because the clock runs out. Marcus never asked to be seen. He just kept doing the work. And the saddest part of this story isn't what corporate did to him. It's how long it took anyone to look. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been the person staying late, fixing what nobody noticed, honoring something your family gave you, drop it in the comments. We read everyone. If this moved you, hit like right now. It helps people who need to hear this actually find it. And if you know someone doing quiet, unnoticed work that deserves to be seen, share this with them today. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. It costs nothing, and it might mean everything. This is a fictional, dramatized story created for educational and inspirational purposes. All supporting characters, businesses, and events are fictional. Any resemblance to real persons other than Chris Hemsworth is coincidental. Narration is AI assisted.